السلام عليكم.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله هيا على الصلاة هيا على الصلاة هيا على الفلاح هيا على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونتوب إليه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهدي الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. أما بعد. The theme I was inviting us to consider today, inshallah, talking about is that of Isra wal Mi'raj. It is a theme that is rich with tradition, wisdom, knowledge, and quite frankly also extraordinary thoughts and ideas, because they belong to the realm of the supernatural and the miracle. To introduce such a topic needs to always come with considerable caution, because the literature about this particular event has become an amalgamation of authentic tradition and knowledge, and shall we say collections of exaggerations and unauthentic knowledge that causes the commingling of these two things to dilute from the good and the learning into a domain that is rather slippery with where it can lead to. It's a tall order, quite frankly, to disambiguate both of these things and have them presented in a way that makes sense I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give me the wisdom and the patience so I do, inshallah, justice to this environment. And if I make a mistake, I have only myself to blame and ask Allah to forgive me. First, by way of introduction, let's provide the historical context that allowed for this to happen and the reaction to it that causes a lot of the transmission that come to us to cause us a little bit of a headache. The Arabs at the time of the arrival of Islam were sandwiched between a number of dominant civilizations that had a rather well-established culture that was multidimensional and had the ability to cover many things that were unknown to the Arabs. And when the Prophet ﷺ came in and offered some alternatives very easily, pedagogically lowered to the common denominator so everybody gets to absorb them, despite their simplifications, they still caused many of the recipients to have inner and outer conflicts with what they were hearing. So let's take a few examples of these. To the east of Arabia, Mesopotamia had an extremely elaborate, for close to 7,000 years before the arrival of Islam, an extremely elaborate world beyond the visible one. Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, all of these long before Islam had introduced a world beyond the visible that explained certain things that were mythical. They had angels, they had a heaven, they had the sort of narrative of functions of the various angels and what they did. They had layers of the heavens. The number in their time was 8, not 7, but it doesn't matter. They had a construct which they documented. And they passed them on from one generation to the other. And the most sophisticated of all, and basically the authors of all of these constructs, were the Sumerians, and Ur was the big place where all of this took place. Then it moved to the Akkadians, they changed the capital and they changed the language, the concepts remained the same. Then it arrived to the Babylonians, and suddenly when the Jewish communities in Babylonia connected with this reality, the references were known to those communities. So that's the activity and the historical context to the east of Arabia. Directly to the west of Arabia, actually very close to Mecca, was the experience of the Egyptians. The Egyptians had an equally elaborate idea of the world of the unknown, but it was not centered into the development of a cosmic reality that was very rich. They focused very narrowly on one thing, and that is the concept of life after death. And they had a very elaborate narrative on how they understood life after death, which is essentially that this experience that we have as human beings is ephemeral and it will end very quickly. Then we transition to another world, and in their world, the gateway to go to the other world was obviously those things that are called the pyramids, the tombs. And then when you come out on the gate one way, you can exit from another, and you can find another Nile, which is existing into the supernatural world. Then you go on that journey. And much like what you do in this world here, you provision for the other one. And that's why when they were buried, they would bury with them their provisions and their servants and everything else to go to the other world. And they documented all of this in something called the Book of the Dead, etc. So the Prophet ﷺ comes to his community and suggests to them that part of the theology of Islam and the doctrinal system of Islam, he's introducing to them the one God, which they had the hardest time accepting as an idea, but he's also introducing to them this complex reality that seems to have heavens and angels and life after death. And quite frankly, the community in Mecca capped on its absorption and just couldn't take it. So the whole notion to the Arabs who were pagans at that time of something called life after death was total anathema, like, wait. We thought that when we die and we get underground, we just become dust and it's done. So what is this whole thing that comes after it? So they had a very, very hard time with that. And that conflict and tension remained between the Prophet ﷺ as the teacher and as the prophet, and the community as the recipient in that. And so we can safely say, perhaps, that after about 9 years of making da'wah in Mecca, that the outcome of the effort of the Prophet ﷺ was, shall we say, highly limited, if not called a failure. It just did not pan out. Very few people accepted him, very few people accepted his message. Clearly, very few people accepted the notion and the doctrine of monotheism and this world that he was talking about that was gonna come. But unlike the stories of old, the Prophet ﷺ, up to the 9th year, did not show, if you wish, the trump card, the big idea that usually has swayed people in the past, which is a miraculous act of epic proportions. Things like what Musa ﷺ did by splitting the seas and making them part way, or what Isa ﷺ did by raising people from the dead. The Prophet ﷺ did not exercise on any of those options in the Meccan period to this scale and to this environment. Roughly around the 9th year, the life of the Prophet ﷺ starts to come apart piece by piece. The biggest loss he suffers was the loss of Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha. Effectively, he didn't simply lose his half, his wife. He lost in her the first believer, the first companion, his support, moral, financial, unconditional love and commitment to his life, and the person that would help the Prophet ﷺ make sense of everything that doesn't make sense. That was her role in his life. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls her to him, and she's done, and it's her time to go. That vacuum emptied the life of the Prophet ﷺ from one of the biggest pillars on which he was rested. Same year, he loses Abu Talib and the support that comes with him. For us today, like losing a family member, however traumatic and tragic it is, we have some sort of rationalization because as social beings, our networks are extended, but our individuality is clear. Not in 7th century Arabia. There was no such thing called individual rights and human rights and legal rights. You had none of those. What defined your right to life or your right to be was your relationship to your tribe. If you belonged to a tribe that would cast out their position vis-a-vis you by saying, we protect you and you belong to us, you're good. If you lose that, you have a catastrophic life because you basically exist as an island by itself. Abu Talib was the blanket for protection for the Prophet ﷺ. Now that he is gone, basically all of the monsters at the gate can come after the Prophet ﷺ and he has no protection. Nobody can stand in front of him. So that's the significance of that second loss. The Prophet ﷺ then realizes that the last hope he has in his strategy in that neighborhood is to change geography. So instead of taking the message over and over again to the Meccans and have him get it refused and rejected, he decides to go to Taif, which is a neighboring town to Mecca that has the political clout to be influential. which is basically an adjacent solution, but not too far out where you can get lost in the wilderness, which was very smartly guided on behalf of the Prophet ﷺ. As we all know, the invitation to Taif did not go as planned. The Prophet ﷺ gets the three tribal leaders of Taif to reject him flat out, and to add insult to injury, to get him out of Taif, they send him out with absolute humiliation. That's the first time that the Prophet ﷺ was officially injured physically, with physical body, in his forehead, and the blood ran into his things. He lost one of his frontal teeth, was broken, etc. So all of this came together at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So you think about that 9th year, 1 year before Hijrah, as being basically a year where the Prophet ﷺ has come to a point, and that particular point seemed to have communicated to him something clear. All of the doors on which he has been knocking closed up on him. Big question. Where do you go from here? That's a very, very tough situation to go and figure that out. Where do you go from here? When you are essentially endowed with a mission that is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to deliver on the commitment to be a Rasul, to be a messenger to people. And you can't come back with a scorecard that says zero achievement on all of the stated objectives. That's kind of anathema. It doesn't connect. So you're going to go, for lack of a better term, start looking outside the box to go and think about this. In comes this idea of al-Isra that is followed by al-Mi'raj. So there is what might be called here divine intervention. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes into the life of the Prophet ﷺ and acts upon it directly, not by proxy, but acts upon it directly. By taking the Prophet ﷺ in the company of Jibreel from al-Masjid al-Haram to al-Masjid al-Aqsa into a nightly journey, and then taking him into some place that he apparently used the mode of transportation called the Mi'raj, to go to it, to ascend in it, or to enter it, in order to experience a world which is a world that is unseen, unknown to the eye, and unknown to the experience of mankind. So let's take these two side by side. But perhaps before we go there, because this is very common in the literature of Islam about this particular event, let us establish something for certain. Everything that you read or you come across that starts to take this whole experience and reductively brings it down to something, well, this whole thing happened in the mind of the Prophet ﷺ where he was asleep, or none of this. We recognize that it's real, but it didn't really happen as physical movement and all of that, or that the Prophet ﷺ might have imagined this or dreamt it up or whatnot. Just be very careful in not adopting or accepting that literature or accepting what comes to it, because the standard for us to either accept or reject something factually comes only from an authority in our religion that is based on two sources: the Quran and the direct report of the Prophet ﷺ. And it so happens on these two events, both the Quran and the Prophet ﷺ spoke in no uncertain terms. So the first one, when it comes to the Isra, the nightly journey from al-Masjid al-Aqsa, from al-Masjid al-Haram to al-Masjid al-Aqsa, it comes to us by way of Surah al-Isra. بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, سبحان الذي أسرى بعبده ليلا من المسجد الحرام إلى المسجد الأقصى. Glory be to Allah, who has taken his servant by a night journey from al-Masjid al-Haram, which is Mecca, to al-Masjid al-Aqsa, which is the farthest mosque, which we'll talk about in a second. And then he says, الَّذِي بَارَكْنَا حَوْلَهُ. This furthest place is a place where we have blessed its surroundings. Why did he do all of this? لِنُرِيَهُ مِنْ آيَاتِنَا الْكُبْرَى, such that we show our servant from our greatest signs, or our wondrous or miraculous signs, things that have not been seen before at the scale, the scope, or the impact of the experience. إِنَّهُ هُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْعَلِيمُ. Verily, Allah is the all-hearing and the all-knowing. So to that, the pedantic debate as to whether or not, did the Prophet ﷺ physically move between the two locations, or did he see it in his eyes, mind, and it didn't happen? We are not going to get into this. It's pretty clear by here that there was physical movement from one place to the other. Is it very challenging? Yes, it is. Do we think we understand it with the norms of time and space as they understood it in the 7th century? Probably not. Do we think we can understand it as modern Muslims? I think we can. I think we can, certainly. Since 1925, there is this little guy who came to a bigger guy before him called Newton, a little guy called Einstein. He went to Newton and he says, your understanding of what space and time is not what you think it is. It's a much more fluid idea called a space-time fabric, where these things can fold and distort, and if you measure a meter here, it does not measure a meter there. And if you measure an hour here, it does not measure an hour there. And things are very different. So for us to understand the concept of how is it possible that the Prophet ﷺ went from Mecca to Medina in a twinkle of an eye, I don't know the secret sauce, but is it possible? The answer is absolutely yes. And I wouldn't be shocked that such things can be realized in the realm of the divine, as why it is being the case. So that's the episode of Al-Isra. Then comes to us this episode of Al-Mi'raj, which I will absolutely not go into, because that will take obviously 4 to 8 hours to just describe the various steps that have been taken in there. So suffices to say that it starts from the farthest mosque, where the Prophet ﷺ leads in prayer about 120-some thousand prophets and messengers who came to honor him, 400 of which were the messengers that were known by the books represented in the Quran, and the other 120,000 someones are the ones that are prophets that are somewhat obscure. Sometimes we know the names of which, and sometimes we don't. They stood behind him in prayer, and he led them in prayer, pretty much signaling that he is the Imam of Al-Anbiya wal-Mursaleen, which means the leader, the prayer leader and the guide of all of the prophets and messengers that came before him, in order to culminate that exercise of the da'wah from the beginning of time until the arrival of the Prophet ﷺ. And then the Prophet ﷺ gets into this journey, which is very well known and documented, that everybody repeats every day, until he arrives to this place that is called Sidrat al-Muntaha, which is called the farthest tree that belongs to the genus of the thing called Sidra, which is a type of tree that was known into the Arabian desert. We won't get into that either. And then beyond that point, which is the only thing I'll cover for the remaining of the time that we have, 3 things happen to the Prophet ﷺ that are not commonly shared amongst Muslims over and over again. The first one that I want to talk about is the special event of a fragment of revelation that took place when the Prophet ﷺ was in the neighborhood of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala beyond that point of Sidrat al-Muntaha. So what is this particular thing? As we all know as Muslims, and we read and confirm, and it is in fact established by fact and history, the Quran, the entire experience of the Quran was subject to a process that's called revelation. That revelation came over a period of 22 or 23 years, beginning with the verse Iqra and ending up with various controversies as to what was the last verse or the last surah that was revealed, until the entire compilation of the Quran was provided to the Prophet ﷺ by Jibreel alayhi salam, as it was provided from its source from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is true, with the exception of 2 verses in the Quran. There are only 2 verses that did not go through this route. They are the 2 last verses of Surah Al-Baqarah. Those 2 verses, when the Prophet ﷺ was ascended and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took the Prophet to him, As one of the gifts that he has given him, he has provided him with the two last verses of Surah Al-Baqarah, who were revealed by Allah to the Prophet ﷺ in that location on the night of Al-Mi'raj. So they are the two verses only in the entire Quran that have not experienced the phenomenon of revelation like everything else. And this is why there is a famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that if these two verses are recited by a believer once a day, it will be enough for that person for the rest of his needs, in terms of protection, in terms of need, and in terms of other things. So that's fact one. So think of it this way. If one of my brothers or sisters in this audience here, I hear about them going to Umrah, and I wish, and I don't have the privilege to do the same trip like them, and I hear about them going, so I will come pay my respects, bid them farewell, and then I will ask them to make dua for me. So they will go make Umrah, but then they remember me in that sacred place, and they would say, wouldn't it be nice if I go back to Boston, and as I arrive, I share with Brother Lazzouni a small gift or token from there, so I will bring him something from my presence and my experience in Umrah to share it with him here. So maybe they will gift me a copy of the Quran or prayer beads or something like that. So that experience is now represented by the token of that visit in the form of a gift that's given to the recipient. So these two verses, the last two verses of Surah Al-Baqarah, are exactly that. It's the gift that the Prophet ﷺ brought back in returning from there to give them to his community, who has been benefiting from them from his time all the way to today, and inshallah for as long as the Ummah of Muhammad will continue to go, those gifts will be there. So that's one. The number two, in order to, if you wish, for a consolation prize, or for helping the Prophet ﷺ cope with all of the losses and the difficulties and everything else into the experiences, the Prophet ﷺ ends up with the gift bestowed to him for his gift, for his Ummah, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells him in that place, if the members of the Ummah of Muhammad ﷺ abstain from shirk, they do not get involved in false doctrines that get confused about the theology of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they will be guaranteed the grace of entering into Jannah. That was given to the Prophet ﷺ as the second gift on that day. And the third and last one, which is also very commonly known, obviously, is that of Salat. Now, that last one is interesting for Salat in the following way. Everyone, without exception, including non-Muslims, know that Islam is built on 5 pillars. But then there is a delivery process. The provisioning of the 5 pillars was then different. 4 of the pillars were provisioned here. The Prophet ﷺ gets a command and starts to model it. And so from this point on, Siyam starts, and Ramadan starts. And from this day on, Zakat starts. Or he goes to Hajj, and from this day on, Hajj becomes an obligation on all Muslims. Or so is the case with Shahada, except Salat. The Salat, like the 2 last verses of Surah Al-Baqarah, was provisioned in the heavens and sent for implementation here. So one way to think about it is that Salat amongst all of the pillars of Islam becomes the key that connects us between the seen and the unseen. The experience of this life and the experience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The connection, the sila, the connection between the two of us becomes distinct. For its honor, it did not get provisioned here. The Prophet ﷺ raised the Prophet ﷺ to him in order to gift it to him there, so it can be brought together and brought here. That's the significance of Al-Isra wal-Mi'raj that I wanted to focus on. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه فيفوز المستغفرين. الحمد لله ثم الحمد لله وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Before coming in, I received 2 specific requests. One is probably known to some of you and maybe not known to many of you. is Sheikh Yamani, who's a supporter of this mosque from its very, very early days and has done so much for it, has passed away. And one of the wonderful things about investing oneself and resources into a sadaqah jariyah such as a masjid to really build an institution is inshallah ta'ala for those gifts that he has gifted this community and he has gifted this institution to return to him amply. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept from him. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant him al-rahmah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give patience to his family. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he returns the favor that he has done in many, 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 many favors over. The second request that I have received is that there is a sister who's suffering from leukemia and she's battling the treatment with ups and downs, and she has asked for our support, inshallah. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by asking him, oh Allah, oh Allah, oh Allah, oh Allah, grant our sister shifa, oh Allah, grant our sister relief, oh Allah, grant our sister support, and oh Allah, grant her family support and relief as well. And now we turn, inshallah, ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. اللهم انصر من نصر دين محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم واجعلنا منهم، واخذل من خذل دين محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم ولا تجعلنا منهم. ربنا تقبل منا صلاتنا. عباد الله، أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله وأقم الصلاة إن الصلاة تنهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر.
الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله هيا على الصلاة هيا على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
استووا واعتدلوا. الله